sorry. Oh, can I give you this one? All right. This is an apocalypse. It's a text. And I want you to imagine for a moment, take yourself back about 2,000 years and imagine this as a sort of a visionary space that you might enter into, because this would have been the equivalent of contemporary entertainment for people several thousand years ago. Here's today's apocalypses, and this is what we're here to talk about. And you'll see that in a number of contemporary video games that we do have a lot of the same themes about violence in the end times, and I'm going to talk about some of the other ways that contemporary video games are like apocalypses. Here's another. You can see the cityscapes that you recognize that are destroyed. Some contemporary gaming evokes explicit religious imagery and otherworldly spaces, so we can also see apocalyptic kind of action going on there. And so what I'm particularly interested in today are video games that actually fit the definition of apocalypse. So these 3 games actually draw on existing apocalypses from several thousand years ago. So they're based. So there's a real connection here. I'm not just making this up. So you can see Darksiders here, which is based on the book of Revelation. You can see El Shaddai, which is based on a book called the Book of the Watchers. And you can see Left Behind, which is also based on the book of Revelation. So there's something really interesting going on here with this connection. Where do I click? Okay. And this is a definition of apocalypse that biblical scholars developed. And I want to just walk through a little bit of it with you so you're familiar with some of the things that I'm interested in. So imagine my surprise when I read this definition and I said, oh my gosh, this is what video games are doing for us today. So an apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature, so it comes from somewhere else, right? Imagine some sort of visionary encounter with another space. It has a narrative framework, so it has a sort of story component to it. And it's mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, and that's a really interesting piece, and I'm going to show you a bit more about that in a moment. It discloses a transcendent reality, some other reality that we imagine, sometimes that we wish we could enter into, some sort of space that sort of allows us to see the world the way that we wish that it was. And this vision that we have is both temporal, meaning it has to do with time, and it's also spatial, meaning it has to do with space. So there's sort of structure involved, and I'm going to say more about that as well. So here are our apocalypses and our visionary worlds that we like to enter into. We multiply them every day. So this is definitely something that we care an awful lot about. And you can see the screen there, right, as a sort of the portal into which we imagine entry into these otherworldly spaces. Well, this happens in religion too, right? We set apart spaces and time where we're going to enter into structured and ordered spaces where things make sense, where they're under control, where we feel like there's a programmer, we feel like there's a purpose, right? So video games are doing some of the same work that religion has done for us throughout history. And so we can see here in El Shaddai an example of that. Here's a shot from the game, and it actually takes place, it begins in heaven. And then the main character, you play as Enoch. He's sent down to earth to gather up the fallen angels and bring them back to heaven for judgment. And that is exactly what happens in the original text as well. So these gamers recognize, too, that there's some kind of really interesting connection going on here. All right, so remember I promised to tell you something about otherworldly guides. Here are some examples. If you play Halo, you may know Cortana. She's meant to sort of serve as a sort of liaison for you, explaining to you what to do, where to go, how to behave. Same thing happens for Link with Navi up there in the right-hand corner. And Navi actually means prophet in Hebrew, so there's another connection for you. And then Lucifer, who shows up in El Shaddai. So in ancient apocalypses, we have these guides, right, who sort of explain to us how the order and the structure of this otherworldly space works. We have the same structure going on in contemporary games. So this is an imagining of the book of Revelation by a very famous artist who wanted to illustrate everything that he could from the Bible. He was really interested in taking the structure of the text and making it visual. So here's his sketch of the book of Revelation, and you can see that element of time and that element of space, right? Sort of imagining entry into an otherworldly structured space that offers you comfort. And this is Darksiders, so you can see the same principle at work there, right? The way that you win at most of these games is that you move in a very measured way through fixed spaces, controlled by time, that you have a particular goal, you have a particular purpose. So it's no surprise that these kinds of experiences are especially appealing to us today, because we live in a time of what some would call a sort of global chaos. We're confused about who we are and where we're going and what we want out of life and how we all fit together. So it's not really any surprise that we find it comforting to enter in these kinds of temporary spaces.
And as Rachel just said, there is rules and this structure through software. And for some players, there's a divide between what's happening in video games and what's happening in real life. And that's a concept called the magic circle. And the magic circle was created by Johan Huizinga and later applied to digital media by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman. And with this concept, a psychologist, Michael Amter, talked about how there's a protective frame between the game itself and real life so that issues that are happening in real life will not cross over into the gameplay. So you enter the game, you play the game, you have fun, then you leave and you go into your real life and you have your real life issues and problems. But spillover can happen when you look at controllers and consoles themselves. So I'm going to go through a couple of these. And it's important to look, I know the first four, it's ancient, it's what we're not used to looking at, but they're important to look at in the scope of things. So the first one in the first generation is the Magvox Odyssey, which was created in 1972 and was the first console and controller that was allowed in the household. So this allowed, you were able to play in your household, and it allowed digital immersion to come into the household. And digital immersion continues throughout this entire spectrum. In the second, third, and fourth, the Atari 2300, the Nintendo's NES, and Genesis Sega, there's no real evolution of this insane and wonderful digital immersion, but you can look at the controllers themselves and how they have been molded to fit more comfortably in the player's hand. In the fifth generation, Nintendo 64 came out with the first controller with the rumble pack. Now this allowed the player to feel the consequences of their gameplay through vibrations. So what they were seeing physically is now you feel it. And what you're seeing visually is now what you're feeling physically. In the sixth generation, Microsoft Xbox came out with the game Halo, which Rachel Wagner had already talked about. But with Halo, this created a worldwide gameplay. Other games, you can say, Rachel, I know, we play these online games, it's great. But Xbox was the first game that really created this buzz and this worldwide gameplay. The seventh generation with the Nintendo 64 is what I believe digital immersion takes to the next step. No longer are you connected to the actual console itself, but you're able to move and actually transform the controller into what you want to do. So it's now a race car, you now have a golf club, it's a tennis racket. In the eighth generation, there's no console, because you are now the console and the controller itself. This is the Microsoft One's Kinect, so now you physically are controlling what's happening on the screen. And spillover can continue into real life through military and through military training. So no longer is there this magic circle, there's no longer this divide between real life and gameplay. Games have entered into real life, and your real life is now being affected by these gameplays. So I'm going to give a couple examples of some training. So the first one is Doom 2. So Doom 2 is a game, it was a first shooter game, and it was actually reskinned by the US Marines for training purposes. So the top image is the image that you will see if you actually play Doom 2 in 1992. You are a space marine fighting demons from hell. And the bottom version is you are now a US Marine fighting enemies found in an enemy bunker. So you're using this training module as a game, but yet you're getting real-life experience from it. This continues to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. This is an elevated version of what they're doing right now. It's actually a dome, and the gameplay has been elevated to a point where there's no longer a connection or dissolve between what's happening in real life and the games. You are, as you can see, they have guns themselves, and there's visual images completely around 360 degrees. And Phil Puckett, who is an officer there, says it has all the aspects of normal gameplay that you would see, but has been applied to the military itself. Now, you might say, Rachel, training is important for military, and I agree. I come from a family who have many people who fight in the military, but this spillover effect is what's dangerous. This is an image of a drone warfare bunker. You have two people sitting with controllers and monitors. No longer does this not look like, you're on the field of battle, but you're sitting in front of a screen, and what you're affecting has real-life consequences. Your gameplay can end someone's life. Orson Scott Card's Ender Game shows a kind of window into what might happen in our future America and impending apocalypse. It's set in a future America where the impending alien race, and Ender, who is one of the characters, is chosen to be the next military captain after extensive training through consoles that are controlled by your mind. So the digital immersion that we talked about earlier has now taken a step forward. So he is chosen, he runs simulation after simulation, what might seem as gameplay, and he plays his final simulation, and he wins the game. But what he does not know is it was not a game, it was actual reality. And he had just created genocide of the entire alien race. So how far will digital immersion take us? Will Orson Scott Card's fictional reality become our ultimate one with the apocalypse of drone warfare?
The violence of war is real, even if it sometimes seems like a game. This is one artist's imagining of what it looked like in Jerusalem in 70 CE when the temple was destroyed, and this was the same time that a lot of artists were producing apocalyptic visions. But the apocalypticism that they imagined here was one in which God was active and humans were passive, right? They waited for him to bring about the judgment. But what we see in Ender's Game is that humans are active and God is passive. So we're sort of taking that role upon ourselves. So do you remember our textual apocalypse? This is one artist's imagining of John, the author of the book of Revelation. And notice he's looking into heaven as if it's a screen, and he's imagining the kind of order, right, that could be there. So there is a connection between the gaming world and the real world. And the question is, what kind of connection is that? This is a quote from Alexander Galloway, who's a very well-respected gaming scholar, and he says that acts of configuration in video games express processes in our culture that are large, unknown, dangerous, and painful, but they do not express them directly. So what this means is that our games tell us what we care about, and what we care about is violence, and we believe that violence can be controlled by more violence. So the changes evident in our gaming apocalypses that we began with are revealing, because in all of these apocalypses, the agency for bringing this about is put upon the player directly. So you play as Enoch. Instead of reading the story about Enoch and God telling Enoch to go and gather the angels so that he can judge them, that's your job. And you play as the character of War from the book of Revelation in Darksiders. And Left Behind, which you'd think would be different because it's a Christian-produced game, actually puts you in the seat. You're the one who has to defeat the enemies in the end time. God may be in the background somewhere, but is not active in this process. And so here you can see that this agency is exercised through violence in all of the games, through active engagement of defeating one's enemies. But games are just fun, you're going to tell me, right? I'm making too big of a deal about this. Well, I've been thinking a lot about the problem of fun, as I'm calling it, and this is Jane McGonigal, and I'm not going to read you the whole quote, but she basically says that there's a difference between eustress and distress, and eustress is what we feel when we're not actually in any real danger, so this is what our video games are providing for us. Games are fun because we know they'll work out for us, we know they're winnable, we're in control. But in real life, things are actually more complicated, and real suffering can result if we play life as a game. Another very famous scholar, Ian Bogost, introduces us to the concept of procedural rhetoric, which is the processes that we engage with online and in any kind of programming shape the way that we see the world. They shape the choices that we even think are possible in the world. So there's a feedback loop here. Our desire to control our environment makes the gaming world very appealing, and the gaming worldview makes it appealing to see the world in terms of us versus them. But this notion of order can sometimes come at the cost of compassion. It's too easy to demonize, shame, humiliate, ignore, or judge people that we know only in virtual reality. And I've actually seen in my own life the kind of damage that this can do to young people and to my international friends as well if they're presented as a kind of symbol and not as a complex person. But fortunately, these are not the only rules out there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about cosmopolitanism to close this up on a lighter note and give you other options. This is a philosophical worldview that says, you know what, things are really complicated, and we're going to have to learn how to talk to one another and how to get along. There is no winner. This is not a game. We're just people trying to learn something about one another. So we need to complicate things a little bit more. We need to learn to listen. We need to learn to be curious. And we need to respect more the complexity of human life. So Martha Nussbaum says fear is a dimming preoccupation, a focus on the self that casts others into darkness. And it may seem essential in a genuinely dangerous world, but it is one of life's greatest dangers. And here's a couple of more cosmopolitan thinkers who invite us to think about difference. The first one, the proof of any real celebration of difference is the right of the other to participate fully in defining the terms of the dialogue. So this should be a conversation, not a game. It is necessary to constitute the freedom to listen to contradictory and conflicting narratives of belonging. So there's no resolution here. There's just greater and greater understanding. Because in the real world, we live on this planet together, and no one's going to win unless we all do. Thank you.